38 years. That's how long I spent building things I could stand behind. Not poetry literally. Houses, commercial buildings, a parking structure on University Boulevard that I drive past sometimes just to check if it's still holding. I was a general contractor in the Raleigh-Durham area from 1985 to 2023. I started as a laborer, spent 7 years learning the trade before I ever signed a contract as the man at the top of the page. I know what a building needs to stand. I know which cuts you can make without consequence and which ones will come back through the floor 3 years later. I am telling you this because it matters to the story. I am a man who reads documents carefully, every word, every clause, because I have spent my adult life knowing that what's written on a page is what you are agreeing to, not what you meant, not what you assumed, not what seemed reasonable at the time. My son Derek is 39 years old. He is a financial consultant. He has a master's degree in business and a house I helped him buy. In October of last year, Derek came to my home with his wife Jessica and set a document on the oak kitchen table I built for my wife Ruth in 2004, and he asked me to sign it. I want to tell you what happened after that, but I also want to tell you about Ruth's letter, because that's the part that changed everything, not the document, not the lawyers, not any of the things that sound like a story about money. The letter is the story. Let me start from the beginning. My wife Ruth died 2 years ago. She had been a third-grade teacher for 31 years. She taught the same school the entire time, which is not the kind of thing that happens in this era, and she was exactly as good at her job as you would expect from someone who stayed at it that long by choice. We met in 1983. I was 24 and working on a renovation project 3 blocks from the school where she taught. She came by to tell the foreman that the noise was disrupting her afternoon reading session, and could we please schedule the heavy work for before noon. The foreman sent me over because I was the youngest one there. I told her I'd see what I could do. I then spent 3 weeks timing our loudest work to before noon specifically so she'd have no reason to come back. She came back anyway. 40 years. We had 40 years together, and I will not pretend I understood their full value until I was living in their absence. Derek is our only child. He was, for most of his life, closer to Ruth than to me. I was working. This is the honest accounting of it. I was present in the way that men of my generation were present, which is to say I was in the house, I was providing, I showed up to the things I was supposed to show up to. I was not the father who sat at the kitchen table and asked how things were going. I was the father who fixed what was broken and paid what needed paying and assumed that was sufficient. Ruth used to tell me it wasn't quite sufficient. I used to tell her I was doing my best. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was the full story. When Derek married Jessica 8 years ago, I liked her. She's organized, she's direct, she knows what she wants, qualities I respect in anyone. They had 2 kids, Thomas, who is now 11, and Lily, who is 8. I see them every Sunday when Derek and Jessica let me, which has been fairly regular. I'm not going to claim the relationship was difficult or strained. It was what it was, a family that got along well enough without ever quite getting close. Over the years, I gave Derek and Jessica money. Not loans, I want to be specific about this. Money. I paid off the their student loans in 2019 because Derek mentioned they were dealing with high interest rates and I knew what I had in my accounts, and the math was simple. I contributed $65,000 toward the down payment on their house in 2021 because the market had gone insane and I had what they needed, and Ruth had been gone for 6 months, and it felt like doing something. I gave Jessica $22,000 for a business she was trying to launch in 2022. I covered 1 semester of private school for Thomas when they hit a rough patch financially. I never kept a running total. That was a deliberate choice. I wasn't keeping score. I was their family. Total, over 8 years. Somewhere north of $150,000. I knew roughly what it was. I didn't think about it as a number. I thought about it the way I thought about things. I built something done, standing, not in need of review. The green metal box on the shelf in my study has been there since 1985. I keep all my contracts in it, organized by year. I added Ruth's things to it after she died, not all of her things, but the papers that mattered, a habit. I am going to come back to that box. Derek called the week before he came over and said he and Jessica needed to talk about something financial. He sounded the way he always sounds, practical, moving forward. I said, come for dinner. They came on a Wednesday. We ate, Ruth's oak table. Thomas and Lily were not with them. They'd left the kids with a neighbor, which I noted. I made pot roast. We talked about the kids' school, a project Derek was working on, something Jessica had read about interest rates. Normal. After dinner, Derek said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." He took an envelope from the bag he'd brought and set it on the table. "Jessica and I are applying for a business loan," he said. "Commercial real estate. We've been looking at a small rental property. The bank wants our DTI, cleaned up debt to income ratio. We looked into it, and apparently there's a way to formally document informal family loans so they don't show up as outstanding debt." He slid the envelope toward me. "We had a lawyer look at this," he said. "It's a family loan forgiveness agreement. You sign it, it formally acknowledges that the money you've given us over the years was given as loans and that you're forgiving them. It clears our financial record." I looked at the envelope. I looked at Derek. I looked at Jessica, who was watching me with the expression of someone who had done the research and was confident in the research. "I'll read it over," I said. "Of course," Derek said. We had coffee. They left around 9:30. I walked them to the door. I told them I'd let them know. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down at the oak table with the document. I am a man who reads contracts carefully. 38 years, every word. I read the document twice. The first time, I read it for the structure, what it was asking me to confirm. The money had been given as loans. I was formally forgiving those loans. Derek and Jessica's debt was hereby acknowledged and resolved. The second time, I read it for the language. On page 2, there was a clause that had been buried in the middle of a paragraph. I pulled out a pen and circled it. The clause read, "Grantor acknowledges having received equivalent consideration in the form of familial companionship, emotional support, and services rendered by grantees in their capacity as family members over the period of this agreement." I sat with that for a moment. In contractor language, I was being asked to sign a document stating that Derek and Jessica had already paid me back through being my family. Through visiting, through existing as my son and daughter-in-law, the visits, the Sunday dinners, the years of being Derek's father, those were the repayment. I do not believe Derek understood what that clause meant. I am going to say that clearly. I believe Derek had a lawyer draft something based on a template and didn't read it with the care it required. I believe he handed it to me the same way people hand you a car rental agreement, something to sign, not something to study. But the clause was there, and I had read it. I put the document in the green box and went to bed. I did not sleep particularly well. In the morning, I called Pete Morrison. Pete has been my accountant for 22 years. He is 62 years old and has the particular quality of people who work with numbers for a living. He gives information without drama. He does not offer opinions unless he is asked. His office smells like coffee and paper, and he speaks more slowly when he's about to say something important. I told him what Derek had presented. I told him about the document. I described the clause. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "George, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it carefully. Did you ever, at any point, discuss with Derek the expectation that these funds would be repaid?" I said no. The word loan had never been spoken. I said, "I gave him the money the way you give someone you love, something they need." Pete said, "I thought so." He paused. "George, every year, when the amounts you gave exceeded the annual gift exclusion, I filed a Form 709, a gift tax return. We've been doing that since 2019. I said, "I remember you mentioning it. I didn't really think about what it meant." He said, "What it means is that the IRS has federal records, official filings, under your Social Security number, classifying every one of those transfers as a gift. Not a loan, a gift." He spoke slower now. "Derek's document asks you to sign something that contradicts federal tax filings you've already made. If he were to try to claim these were loans in any legal context, he'd be going up against the IRS's own records." The kitchen was quiet. I could hear the refrigerator running. I said, "Pete, can I get copies of all those returns?" He said, "I'll have them to you by end of day." I thanked him. I set the phone down on the table, Ruth's table. I ran my hand along the grain of the oak the way I sometimes do, a habit from years of working with wood, checking for what's underneath the surface. I did not feel triumphant. That is not the right word for what I felt. I felt something closer to exhaustion, the specific kind that comes when you've been worrying about something without fully admitting you were worrying about it. And then the thing resolves, and you realize how much energy you'd been spending on it. I also felt something I had not expected. I felt sorry for Derek. Not the condescending sorry that someone in the right feels for someone in the wrong. The real kind. The kind where you recognize that someone you love is about to have to sit with something uncomfortable, and you'd rather it weren't necessary. I called Tom Becker. He handles my real estate and estate work. I told him what Pete had found. I told him what was in the document. Tom said the clause was, in his assessment, aggressive at best and fraudulent at worst, and that I had no obligation to sign anything and every right to pursue the matter if I chose to. I said, I don't want to pursue anything. I want to understand what I'm dealing with and then decide what to do. Tom said that was fine. He'd be available when I needed him. I did not call Derek that day. I made dinner. I watched the sun go down through the kitchen window the way Ruth used to watch it. She used to time how long the direct light stayed on the garden in October. She said it got shorter by about 2 minutes every week once October started. She had been tracking it for years. I hadn't known that until after she died, when I found a small notebook with the times written down. This is what I mean when I say I didn't fully understand the 40 years until I was living in their absence. The gift tax returns arrived by email that afternoon, 9 of them, neatly organized. I printed them and put them in the green box next to Derek's document. When I opened the box, I saw the letter. I had put it there not long after Ruth died, when I was going through her things and finding the papers that needed to be kept somewhere safe. I remembered putting it in the box. I had not opened it since. It was a letter Ruth had written to Derek on his 30th birthday, 9 years ago, before she was sick, before any of this. She had given it to him at the time, but he had returned the original to her at some point. I found it among her things, which meant Derek had given it back to his mother for safekeeping, which is its own thing to think about. I sat down at the kitchen table and read it. Ruth had been a third-grade teacher for 31 years. She knew how to write to someone in a way that reached them. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, on the pale blue paper she used for correspondence. She wrote about what she hoped for Derek as a man. She wrote about Jessica with warmth and specificity. She wrote about Thomas, who had just been born, and then she wrote about me. I am not going to quote the full passage. I have read it enough times that I could, but it feels like something that belongs to our family and not to this story. What I will tell you is that Ruth wrote about the way I love people through building things for them, through fixing what's broken, through showing up in practical ways rather than expressive ones. She wrote that she had spent 40 years learning to read this language, and that she hoped Derek would learn to read it too, before it was too late to appreciate it. She wrote, "Your father has never been good at saying what he feels. He is very good at showing it. Those are not the same thing, and they are not equal. And I hope you don't spend as long as I did figuring out the difference. He loves you the way a man who builds things loves, not with words, but with weight. What he makes to last." I sat at the oak table for a long time. Ruth had known. She had known for 30 years that there was a gap between what I offered and what Derek was able to receive, and she had been trying, in her way, to bridge it. She had written this letter and given it to our son, and he had read it 9 years ago, and he had still walked into this kitchen with a document asking me to confirm that the money I gave him the weight I had been carrying was a loan, not love. I do not think Derek had forgotten the letter. I think he had read it as a son reads a compliment from his mother warmly, with love, and without the understanding that it was also a warning. I sat until the kitchen was dark. Carol from next door had her lights on. I could see them from the window. I made myself coffee. I thought about what I was going to do. I want to explain why I called Derek before I did anything else. Tom would have handled it. A letter from Tom's office explaining the gift tax situation, making clear that the document Derek had presented was legally untenable, that would have been clean, professional, and would have put Derek on notice without a direct confrontation. It would have also been, from a legal standpoint, the smarter move. I did not do that first. I called Derek. I called him because Ruth had written a letter about the way I love through weight and doing and showing up, and I did not want the most important conversation I'd had with my son in years to happen through an intermediary. It was a Thursday evening. Derek answered on the second ring. I said, "I need to talk to you about the document." He said, "Sure, Dad. What questions do you have?" I said, "I'm not calling with questions. I'm calling with information." There was a brief pause. "Okay." I told him what Pete had found. I explained, calmly and without commentary, that every financial transfer I had made to him over 8 years had been filed with the IRS as a gift. I told him what this meant legally for his document. I told him that the clause on page 2, the one about companionship and services rendered, was something I needed him to understand I had read and understood. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I didn't know that clause was in there." I said, "I believe you." He said, "We got the template from, Jessica found it online. We had a lawyer look at it, but it was a quick review. I didn't read it line by line." He stopped. "What does that clause actually mean?" I said, "It means that if I signed it, I would be legally acknowledging that you had already repaid me through being my son. Silence. Derek, I said, I'm not angry. I need you to understand that. But I need you to understand what I'm telling you. He said very quietly, I'm an idiot. I said, no. You're someone who moved too fast on something that required more care. Another silence. Then he said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm not going to sign the document. Pete is going to send you a letter explaining the gift tax situation so you can give it to your bank and they can reclassify those amounts correctly. It should actually help your DTI more than the forgiveness agreement would have because gifts don't count as debt. He said, oh. I said, Derek, I want to read you something. There was a pause. Okay. I had the letter in front of me. I had decided at the kitchen table that this was what needed to happen. That the conversation between us had been missing a third voice for 2 years, and this was the closest I could get to having it. I read him the passage about how I love. Ruth's words, not mine. When I finished, there was a long silence. Derek said, Mom wrote that? I said, on your 30th birthday, I found it in the green box. He said, she gave it back to me and I gave it back to her because I thought she should have the original. He stopped. I remember reading it. I was in the car afterward. I said, did you read it carefully? He didn't answer immediately. Then, I thought I did. I said, I think she wrote it because she knew something about how we were together, you and me. And I think she hoped it would help us do better than we'd been doing. I paused. I don't know that either of us did. He said, Dad, and then nothing for a moment. I'm sorry. I said, I know. He said, not about the document, about all of it. I said, I know that too. Jessica called me the following day. She called early, before Derek was likely awake, which told me something about her. She said, I want you to know I found the clause. Derek told me about it last night and I went back and found it and I feel like an absolute idiot. I said, it was an easy thing to miss if you weren't reading for it. She said, I should have been reading for it. This is your family. She paused. I'm sorry, George. I said, I appreciate you calling. She said, Derek's been up half the night. He doesn't really know how to say this stuff, but I think he's really shaken. I said, I know. He gets that from me. There was a brief, surprised pause. Then she laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. I hadn't heard Jessica laugh like that before. I noted it. Tom sent the clarifying letter to Derek's bank through Pete's office. The DTI situation resolved actually, as Pete had predicted, more cleanly than the forgiveness document would have achieved, because properly documented gifts improved their debt picture better than forgiven loans. They got the financing for the rental property in December. Derek came over 3 weeks after the phone call. He sat at the oak table. He brought Thomas and Lily, which I suspect was partly for armor and partly because he knew I'd want to see them. We had sandwiches. We talked about Thomas's soccer season. We talked about Lily's new interest in drawing horses, which had become an obsession requiring its own sketchbook collection. After the kids had gone outside to kick a ball around in the backyard, Derek said, I've been thinking about what you said, about Mom's letter. I said, what about it? He said, I think I understood it at the time, and then I let it become noise. He looked at the table. I'm not sure when. I said, I let some things become noise too. That's a two-way road. He looked up. What did you let become noise? It was the most direct question he had asked me in years. I said, I let myself believe that if I kept providing, that was enough. That you'd know what I meant by it. I paused. Ruth was trying to tell me that wasn't enough too. I didn't listen as well as I should have. He was quiet for a while. Then, she was trying to tell us both. I said, yes. We sat there for a while. Outside, Thomas and Lily were having an argument about whether the ball had crossed a line they'd drawn with a stick. It was the kind of argument that resolves itself in approximately 45 seconds when children are involved. We could hear them from the kitchen. I want to be honest about where things stand, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. Derek and I are better than we were, not fixed better. We talk more directly than we used to. The Sunday visits are different now. There is less performance in them. Derek asked me things about Ruth that he didn't ask before, and I try to answer them the way she would have wanted me to answer them, with words rather than a project. The document was shredded. The gift tax records are in the green box alongside Ruth's letter. I have not moved either of them. I started reviewing my estate plan more seriously in the months after all this. Not out of fear, out of Ruth's example. She had known something that needed to be said, and she had put it in writing. I began doing the same, not about money, about the things I wanted Derek and my grandchildren to know about how I thought and what I believed and how I had tried to live. Tom called it ethical will preparation. I called it something I should have started earlier. If you are a father or a mother, or anyone who loves someone in a specific way, that means putting material things in front of emotional ones because that's the language you were given. I want to say this. The people you love cannot always read what you're writing in load-bearing walls and fix leaks. Sometimes you have to use actual words, even if they come out slower, even if they're not as well crafted as what you'd build with your hands. Ruth knew this. She said it better than I ever could. She said it in a letter she gave to our son 9 years before she died, and he gave it back to her for safekeeping, and I found it in a metal box in my study on an October afternoon while I was looking for tax returns. I am still figuring out what I should have said earlier. I have a lot of years to make up for, which means I also have a lot of years to do it. Derek asked me once, after everything, what I thought was the most important thing I had ever built. I told him the truth. I hadn't finished building it yet,